Hello everyone, this is Bradley. So today this is a voice recording to make a laser engraving effect, which is different from what I've done in the past. Here we're going to use a little different methods and going with a different style. So let's start. So here we're in Blender. Let's go through noding. As always, I'm going to use presets which you can download for free from the link in the description. Let's start with a string to curves. And I want just a simple setup. Let's just start with a geo. And I'm going to use a customized font. Let's just use the Arial Black I imported earlier. So you can use any kind of font, but I want to illustrate a problem that people suggest that in the previous tutorials, the stroke is double-sided, in which you have an inner and outer. But he wants only just a single part, which means he wants like to fill this entire volume to make it look like a kind of a single stroke filling with this text. This is not how Blender text works. That's why we're going to use a little different method. And the reason I'm using a different font is because I really want to demonstrate that you can definitely draw. For example, I can create a curve. Let's create a Bezier curve and it goes to edit mode. And I have a draw option. I can definitely draw a curve. But whether I draw it in a very good way or bad way, there's always a problem that it does not respect a particular font style. So it causes certain problem. And that's the problem that we're going to resolve today. So the concept still requires this kind of curve, but I'm going to draw in a more sophisticated way, so that it looks nicer. So I'm going to use the unvoiced path, and I'm going to use the select mode. So if I delete all these kind of points, for some reason it no longer is a unvoiced path, but I think it will be fine. Anyway, so let's just hold Control and right click so that we're extruding a point, so that you're filling this curve. I think this is the way which works the best. And then we're going to just duplicate this unvoiced path, and I'm going to basically do the same. This part is not a procedural, unfortunately, but I don't think there's the other way around. And then we're just repeating this process, and let's hit an O, and then just extrude, and it doesn't need to be perfect because it's just an example for the moment, and I'll probably subdivide at more points, and just to make sure the shape is kind of okay. Then we're going to use this curve as a guide to paint on our original text. So here I'm going to use a fill curve, just to give you a sense that once we fill this curve, it turns a curve into a mesh. And now it looks like kind of a single stroke text instead of something with double edges. But this is a mesh, so we cannot use what we've discussed in the old tutorial. That's why we need this curve as a guide to paint on this mesh. This is either triangles or ungans, which is very bad, so we're going to remesh that. So let's just delete that and use the text mesh, so that we're creating a remeshed result. Here I do not need this extrusion, so that's just the extrusion to 0. And looking at the wireframe, voxel size 2% is a little bit too high. So we decrease it, maybe 0.7. Yeah, I think this is nice, and you can smooth that with 15 to make it kind of smooth and beautiful. Okay. The reason we're doing this step is because I want to generate a little bit of point to save the attribute. Okay, and then we're going to paint that. So we start with a curve, and there's a spline parameter which goes from start to the end of the curve as 0 to 1. So by manipulating this effect, so we're going to use an subtract function. Then it goes to the reverse direction. Let's just use add, but it's still a reverse direction. I think just a reverse curve. There are many different ways to achieve that, but anyway. So we goes from start to the end as a white source. Okay. So we're drawing it. And we want to pass this drawing effect to our text mesh. That's why we need a sample nearest. But if you plug that into sample nearest, okay, nothing happens now. Let's take a sample index. We're going to pass this add values and the index into this sample index. So now we're using this text mesh and sampling the nearest and index for our curve. So now if I evaluate this result, you will see there is a warning sign that it says curve is not supported. So we need to curve to mesh. But the moment we start with this curve to mesh, another problem comes in that a mesh does not have a spline parameter. So we have to capture an attribute. It looks like dump, but that's how Blender works at this stage. And once we have done all these steps, then you can start to see that by adding this value, we're drawing a white lines on this text mesh. Okay. And if we do not capture attribute, then you will see it becomes full black and full white. That's why we need this capture attribute to make this mesh remembering that it contains a spline parameter. Here, I want you to understand that by animating this value, you will see there is a kind of clear cutting edges at some point. This is simply because of the principle of this sample nearest, that every of these points will find a nearest target along this curve. And sometimes if points to points contains a very different value, then you will end up having these clear cutting edges. So one way to fix that is trying to change your stroke. Okay. So previously I manipulated this path so it becomes a little bit smoother. Another way to do is to resample curve so that you have a smaller interval and you generate more points. Let's just make it 0.02. Then you can see it immediately becomes much smoother. It's also possible that you use this blur attribute, but it may not be very obvious. Okay, it is obvious somehow, but anyway, you can try with these different methods. But generally, this is kind of idea. I just want you to know that the more points you generate during this resampling process, it might increase the time cost of your setup. Right now, this is just 84 milliseconds. This is kind of okay. So then, just to make everything clear, I'm going to capture an attribute to make sure that this information is stored at this particular stage of our text mesh. Because next, we're going to pass this information to a grid. So let's create a grid and make it like 2, maybe 2, maybe 1.5, maybe 1.2, something like this. And then we're going to subdivide that a lot, maybe 100 and 100. Okay. And then we're going to pass this information onto our grid. Instead of using this sample index and the sample nearest setup, I'm going to use a preset, but I'm going to show you why I'm not using these two nodes in this particular case. So I'm using this text mesh geometry, and then I pass this attribute. So now if I look at my grid and this value, you will see everything is being painted with this whatever stuff. This is because every point on this grid will sample our text mesh. So even if they are very far away, but they will try to get a kind of closest result somewhere. That's why everything will be painted with black and white. But I want to project this result onto our grid. So there are many different ways to do it. It's possible that you use a raycast. Actually, raycast might be easier. Yeah, actually raycast might be easier. So we do not need to use a preset. Let's start with this geometry, because this is where we need to sample information from. And then we use this attribute. And then I'm taking this attribute. Let's recast the direction as 1. So now we get our result. It's not very nice because it's a little bit sharp because of the subdivision level we have, but you can increase the subdivision level and you can also blur it to make it a little bit nicer, hopefully. But this is basically kind of idea. Yes, recast works. So now we just need to animate this value. So now we have this kind of engraving effect painted on to our grid. So since this is working, we're just going to move further with this fall we generated. Here, let's store name the attribute because I want to pass this information to shader. Let's just name that F for off. And now let's set the material. And within our material, I'm going to take this fourth attribute and we can mix it. So by default, this plane can be black and then it becomes white, so that we no longer need a viewer, but by render view or material preview mode, I expect to see it. And then I'll probably want to keyframe this value. Let's just instead of giving it a keyframe with an I, let's take a time info. So this is division factor 25. It means it takes 25 frames from 0 reaching to 1. Let's make it to 80. So divided by 100. and subtract by 1. So now if we play this animation, it takes about 100 frames to complete this effect. Okay, so yes, this is kind of idea. Maybe we can make it a little bit longer so that we see this animation better. So now we have this engraving effect or painting. And then I'm going to use this fourth to make some depression. So we can combine X, Y, Z to the offsets. So now you can see there is a kind of a huge extrusion. Here you will realize they're extruding in a different magnitude because there is a the spline parameter is distinguishing the starting point and the end point. So we clamp that. We clamp the outputs to 0 to 1. So no matter how much I'm adding this value, it will be clamped to 1. Okay. So now they have the same height once they reach the target. The good part of that is since this is a value from 0 to 1, we can remap 0 to 1 so that we can control the height. So I'm going to make a depression. It may not be very obvious, but you can see. And also, we can blur that. We can blur attribute. So that's smoothing out the edges a little bit. Just a little bit. Okay. So now we have this kind of smooth effect. So now we basically have this animation done. We can add some other details, but I also want to mention that since this is a painting based on this text mesh, it means that you can change this thickness of this single stroke by smoothing that more. Okay, it's clamped to 15 because the performance concern, but you can do that more, 75, 125, or 250. So it becomes like this. I don't think this is what people usually want, but it's just a possibility. It really depends on the font you're using. It can be very thin, but eventually you get this kind of. And smoothing that out, you can just use this blur attribute before, or you can use a blur attribute after. They are kind of related to each other, just to be in different stage of smoothing, but they are essentially the same. Okay, and the rest is about adding more stuff to make this animation complete. Next, we are going to make some additional effect to make this animation more completed. But these are kind of things I discussed in the past. So I'm going to have a curve line, and I'm going to instance it to connect that with our NURBS path. So I duplicate the element. It just says spline, and duplicate the domain side and make it into curve. So that's if I have 3 paths, I duplicate it 3 times. Then I set the position, endpoint selection. Start point will be at our empty. because I think this is easier to manipulate. So now if I visualize it, and let's take this empties to the sky. It might be easier to visualize if I bevel curve so that you can see the thickness. And then I set a position, take the endpoint, and then I'm going to sample the curve. This sampled curve should be on our NURBS path as well. And take the positions onto position. So by playing this factor, it's running with this spline path, but we are going to take an index. I think duplicate index should be fine. Yes. Then we are having these 3 curves. So now it just decreased the scale of it. And we are going to connect this time info with the factor. So there's no animation. Anyway, let's join geometry. Interesting, I do not see the animation because it's offset by 1 due to this parameter. This is quite tricky. So I think what I'm going to do is that I'm going to subtract 1. Yes, yeah, this is working. So I offset outside the spline parameter so that I can use a single time info node to drive this animation. Okay. So I'm using this engraving to complete this animation. And I also want to remind you that you can make this fall sharper by just the color ramp it. Maybe you can run it sharper or smoother. Depends on what you want to do, but this is kind of idea. Yes. And you can set radius with time so that finally making it to disappear or something. I don't have time to show it here, so I'm just going to move on to deal with particles, because particles might be a little bit tricky. For particles, we are starting with a point distribute to fill these curves. And I just need to set the amount, as many as possible. And then I'm going to join geometry. I'm going to instance a kind of a cylindrical mesh. And then this is too large. Take a value precision. Make it as tiny as possible. Also give it a random rotation. I guess just a random rotation. And then once we have this fold, because we captured the fold here, we can use that later. we are going to translate instance and combine XYZ using this for. So now, if I play this animation, then you can see they move a little bit. We're going to exaggerate that, take remap 0 to 1. You can see they're flying. These points are flying. Let's make the variations to 0.2. And then let's decrease radius. Make it thin. Change the seed a little bit. So now you can see this particle is flying. And once they fly away, we scale instance. We scale this instance and take a float curve to remap it. So we start from 0, peak in the middle, and make it disappear at 0. So now we have these particles, yes. But you realize this is translate instance at local space. Perhaps I want to remap it a little bit. Yes, so something like this. Okay, so we have this kind of effect of particles flying, and this is basically the idea. I think it might be better if you do a simulation on this particle emission. I talked about the trigger systems and the simulation zones in my other bullets collision tutorials and so on. I think it will be a better method so that you can actually control the time it really costs for these particles to fly. But this is a very fast animation, so I think it may not really matter. But you never know. But I think I completed the concept. To make it really a good animation, you definitely need to do a lot. But I think this is it. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll probably see you next time. Bye bye.